Hi, everybody. This is Genia Engelstad from Elite Escrow Services in San Diego.
And this is PJ Garcia from Beach Pacific Escrow in Huntington Beach.
And this is Escrow Talk. This is episode 6, PJ. This is so exciting.
Wow.
I know, that's what I say.
Where did episodes 1 through 5 go? I just don't know.
I think they're out there on our YouTube channel, which is a little frightening to have our own YouTube, but okay. I don't think that we've ever really given a little bio, and maybe in this time, since people have been listening to us for a while, perhaps, PJ, you should tell us how you started in escrow. I mean, give us the thumbnail. Don't give us the long dissertation, just the thumbnail.
Okay, the thumbnail is my mother was in the business, not the escrow business, but the real estate and mortgage business. And she said, when I got out of high school, you would be really good at escrow.
And you're thanking her every day.
And I'm thanking her every day. So, I am good at escrow. My skill set lends itself to that. And it's something I am passionate about, as most of my escrow associates are, like Gina. But that's basically it. And I got into it sort of by accident, like many people in our business, as an early adopter, and then it went from there. 10 years later, we owned our own company, my husband and I, and
here you are.
We're a family business and into the second generation now.
Wow, yeah, I started in 1979. Actually, I worked at a mortgage banker, James B. Nutter and Company. And I got a job there just being like a helper, closer person, helping people with funding loans, right, and learning how to do that part of it. And they were going to close their San Diego operation. And that was when interest rates, most of us don't think about that, but FHA and loans, 30-year loans were like 18%.
Oh, yeah. I got in 1980, so exactly, 18%, 16%.
But people were only paying $50,000 for a house. It
was keeping the prices down and the market very slow.
So James B. Nutter closed their office, and I got the opportunity to work for another lender or work at an escrow company that had talked to me because we had done closings, and I started working there. So, and then in 1987, I was able to actually purchase that company from the people who were retiring, and so here we are. Wow. So I tell gals in my office that, escrow is a good business, not for women and men, but it's a really good business for women. I think we can come in, we can learn from the ground up, and that's really the way to do it. I think some of the challenges that we have today is people only know how to use the computer. They don't know how to take a pen and a piece of paper and figure it out. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you today about, PJ, is closing statements. We had a couple of people, when we started in escrow, we took a piece of paper, we would handwrite or type our closing statements. And so now all we do is we put the information in the computer and it spits it out. So we have had recently, since the new TRID rules came into effect, we have had lenders say on a transaction when there's a new first and a new second, and they're saying, well, escrow, because of the new TRID rules, we need you to issue 2 closing statements. We want 1 closing statement for the first, and we want 1 closing statement for the second. So, PJ, what do you think about that?
Oh, many things. Let's start by jumping back to what is a closing statement, why do we issue it, and how is it different from a HUD-1 or a closing disclosure? The escrow law in California was enacted in 1947. People were doing escrow before that, but that's when it reached enough people doing it outside the scope of a bank or, say, an insurance company where the thought was we need to actually have rules of the road for these people. And one of the rules of the road that's in our code is that we have to issue a statement of the account to each person in an escrow of what all their debits and credits and disbursements were.
So it's not necessarily like a check register, But the closing statement is a reflection of all the things that were charged to the buyer or to the seller, like a termite report or home warranty or insurance or lender's fees, like
Right.
that.
It's a debit credit statement. It isn't a check register in that it doesn't say we issued this check number XYZ.
Right.
But it does show the payee. It shows the amount that they were paid, and it's a debit credit statement. So that really is our closing statement. And of course, we would issue estimated statements before closing so that people could see and approve and have, of course, so we can ask for how much money we needed from the buyer. And that really has been decades old. We're learning now in this whole TRID wind up to TRID is that many states don't have a closing statement,
Which we think is weird because really the HUD 1 was really for 1 to 4 family
right.
transactions. When we say 1 to 4, one living unit, right, to
Right.
4 living units.
Right.
And people were using that form as a
closing statement.
closing statement.
So so I don't know what they were doing before that. In many states, it's title companies, and I suspect they had some kind of a statement they were doing, or attorneys, and they were doing something before the HUD statement was enacted. But it sounds like they had sort of abandoned that and were just using the HUD 1, whether it really was applicable or appropriate or not.
And in California, we were issuing a HUD if there was a new loan, right? And we were also side by side issuing our debit credit 1-page usually closing statement to show the same numbers that were on the HUD 1, right?
Right. And so what happened is in the 70s, and I can't recall now the exact year, but it was the mid 70s
when RESPA went into effect.
when RESPA was enacted and the HUD came about, and everybody thought the world was going to end because we had this new form. And originally, it's my understanding, because that predates me in escrow, that the escrow people weren't doing the HUD 1. And that sort of evolved to we were issuing it as the quote unquote disbursement document. So it really was an additional closing statement. And that worked for years, and our computer systems just sort of dumped it in, and we issued both. We would, let me say, we would never do a HUD 1 prior to closing. It was a final statement only.
Right.
Before 2010.
2010.
Before 2010, never issued a HUD 1 prior to closing.
But you know what? I agree with you. Sometimes the lenders would say they wanted an estimate, but really that didn't happen prior to 2010.
No, they would.
You're right.
Yeah, they would want an estimate, and we'd send them our estimate, and they would say okay, and use it to do their disclosures, whatever they needed to do. Then the 2010 regulation change came about where they revised the HUD 1 a little bit, and they put in some tolerances, tried to put a little bit of teeth in, because prior to that there was not really any repercussion for not being accurate on the front end of the good faith disclosures.
Disclosing.
As we know, because most of the time we'd see the escrow fee would be $500 no matter what the transaction size was that the lender would complete. They just simply weren't doing any due diligence. Not all, but some.
Correct.
So then in 2010, the rules changed a bit, and then even the realtors started to figure out, I tell you, realtors and lenders who really didn't know much about the HUD 1, all of a sudden, and I think this is because of the coincidence of the heavy short sale market at the time.
I think so too.
All of a sudden, they're quoting line numbers to me. I don't know the line number. I know what it is. You know, I wasn't.
We know it more
but
exactly.
at the beginning,
We
it's
didn't
like
care.
I had to. Yeah, I don't know where my software puts it there. Now I need to understand a little bit better where it is, but it was to the point where you would talk to a funder and say something like, well, I have a closing cost credit. Is there anything excluded for recurring and non-recurring? No, there's nothing excluded. But then we'd get to the funding and I'd say, I can't match with you. You're using a different figure. And finally, after 10 minutes of discussion to figure out she wasn't actually putting in any of the debits and credits on page 1 because they were training to the line number.
Right.
Not to what is the line about, but to the line number. And that's been a little frustrating and challenging. But everybody kind of was at the point where they mostly had that handled. The ironic thing about it is that the effective date for the 2010 revision was January 1st, 2010. By the middle of January, they already were creating the CFPB and starting to work on these new rules. So there was not really any, by the time we had any real feedback on how that was working, we had a new rule in place.
Well, and the other thing is that I know with the 2010 HUD, what happened with that was that after closing, the lenders felt more like they owned that form. You know, it was their form, which really was interesting because we had been the ones issuing it forever. And they'd come back, so we'd give them an estimated HUD, and they'd say, that's fine. And then at funding, they would say, oh, we'll move this figure here or there. And then after closing, when we did it exactly how they wanted to at funding, after closing, they said, well, no, you have to move it. We want this to go to line 1301, and we want this figure to go to line 201, and we want this moved. And we found in our office in San Diego that we were doing these amended HUDs all the time to just move figures around, and that was very frustrating. So with the advent of the new TRID rules that went into effect on October 3rd, right?
Correct.
We have we don't have a HUD really anymore. So let's get back to our question was to closing statements. So you have a transaction where a buyer is buying a piece of property and he's getting two loans. He's getting a first, which is obviously ruled by the new TRID regulations. And then if there's a second, if it's a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, which that's a whole other thing in my mind about is a second that they're fully funding on a purchase, really a HELOC, but whatever. In that case, so you have a first, and the first you're doing the lender's doing a closing disclosure, and the second they require us to do a HUD because that little second is carved out of the rule. So they're doing a closing disclosure and they want us to do a HUD, but then the new requirement all of a sudden is they want us to do two closing statements.
Right, and it's in part because the lending industry hasn't paid a lot of attention to our closing statements for a very long time. So when we started getting these concurrent or piggyback loans during the mortgage run up to the mortgage meltdown, we went to our regulator and said, look, we're having this issue and the lender wants us to issue two statements, and the HUD provided for a statement like that. They have a HUD 1A, which was strictly for a loan, didn't have a lot of detail on it, but what the Department of Corporations at that time said was, that's fine, you have your closing statement, that's your entire transactional document, the picture of it, but what you can do on the HUD 1s, we'll accept that for you to do the HUD 1A with just the fees that affect directly the second, and then transfer the proceeds over onto the HUD 1 as proceeds and balance out your HUD 1 that way, but your closing statement isn't affected. And that's what lenders probably don't understand, is that our closing statement is a picture of the entire transaction. So for us to break it down is very difficult unless we actually do a separate escrow.
Well, and are you disclosing, I mean, because in theory, well, not in theory, but if you have a first and a second, the first lender needs to acknowledge that there is a second, and I assume the second lender knows they're in second position. So to me, it was always a little confusing, but now all of a sudden, because of the TRID rule, which is what the lenders say, they require us and to issue two closing statements. And my pushback has been, no, this is our form. The closing statement is our form. We're required to give a view of the whole transaction, and we can't split those up. Now, some of my escrow friends or our escrow friends are saying, well, what's the big deal? PJ, I mean, why can't we do two closing it's one for the first and the second? And it It's one transaction. It's not two
My
transactions.
first reaction is, gosh, that's a really good way to give people an opportunity for shenanigans to happen. So it's a bad practice, I think. And secondly, a lot of our software systems simply aren't set up for two closing statements in one transaction, because the nature of the closing statement is a picture of the entire transaction. So, and let me just jump back on the HUD to finalize the HUD 1 issue. There's no place on the HUD 1 for initial or final. So that we had to sort of get creative on that when the 2010 rule rolled around. And now I'm starting to hear lenders use the term final HUD 1. Well, there is no such, other terms too, final CD, mock CD, pro forma CD, sample CD, preliminary CD, and none of those exist in the rule, and the form has no provision for that. What the rule says is you must deliver a closing disclosure within a specific time frame before the buyer can sign documents. You can then revise that form as things change and you become aware of them, and most of the time without triggering a new waiting period, although there are three items that trigger the new waiting period. So you're just issuing a new closing disclosure with new information as it becomes available. It is, and so the one they're terming the one that they do prior to issuing documents as the quote unquote final. Well, it isn't final yet. The escrow hasn't closed,
Right.
and therefore it isn't final. And the rule acknowledges that some states are not roundtable wet closing states, they're escrow states. The rule acknowledges it by allowing a 30-day window for the settlement agent to provide the final figures to the lender and for the lender to issue a new closing disclosure post-closing to the borrower, and for the settlement escrow agent to issue a revised version to the seller. So that's part of that. Then when we get to these seconds and concurrent in purchases, it's really not any different than the HUD 1 and the HUD 1A, except that one is a closing disclosure for the first mortgage. It's a closing disclosure, and it's issued on the borrower's side to the buyer by the lender. The second does not fall under the new TRID rules. It falls under the old HUD 1 rules.
And we are the persons that generate that.
And we are, in this point in time, the persons that generate that. So we would issue a HUD or HUD 1 or a HUD 1A. They all come together on our closing statement, and it should all work. But here's the thing. The rule didn't really change as much as people feel like it changed, but the changes were big. And the reason the changes were big on our side is because the penalties are big. And the lenders have been dealing with a lot of change in addition to the TRID rule. And so we need to understand lenders have not only the TRID rules and regulations, but they have the federal Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA guidelines that's on top of that, and investor guidelines that are on top of that. Everybody in the world is doing business from a place of fear right now.
Well, and I think that we need to be gentle with our lender friends.
We do,
but we also need to push back a little bit.
We need to be firm but gentle.
It's not that we can't do it. Of course, we could probably do it all day
physically.
And it's not that our software vendors don't have the capacity probably to write the software to issue two closing statements. But is it good escrow practice, and is it what we should be doing? And I personally don't believe that we should be issuing two closing statements in one transaction. Our closing statements are a reflection of the entire transaction.
And I agree with you. There is a quote, another sort of proper way to do it, and some, I've heard one lender is actually requiring it, where they open a loan escrow,
correct,
for the second, and they make it concurrent with the first, and so it works. Really, it works just like what I described before about doing a closing statement with a HUD 1 and a HUD 1A.
But I wonder why the lenders won't just take the HUD on the second.
Well,
you know
I think they just are.
about.
I think it's just they're not sure yet. They're not sure what the
Right.
right way to do it is. They're guessing. Unfortunately, industry-wide, we were getting not enough guidance from the CFPB because there's no way you can make a rule for an entire nation which does business not only, I mean, for crying out loud, we got 50 plus counties in California, and from north to south, it's like 2 different states.
So if we did a second escrow, we would charge, I would assume you'd charge a fee like you were
You
going
would
to
charge
charge a loan escrow or
Yeah,
refinance
so it
escrow.
increases the cost to the consumer because, you know, it's increasing the cost to the escrow holder. You have to prepare a separate escrow instructions, separate accounting.
But the thing is like I think we should challenge the lender and say, okay, so on September 30th, we did one escrow, one closing statement, but on, October 4th, now you want two. Where is
Right.
it in the rule that says that you must do that? And it really
It
isn't.
isn't in the rule.
Now you were at an Escrow Institute of California meeting the other day. This is January of 2016. There was a specialist meeting, and I think you guys had a pretty raucous discussion about this very issue. Should we be doing two closing statements? And there was a lot of conversation in the room, and I think from what I hear, there was the consensus of the room is that we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it's not something that we should be doing.
The consensus of the room that we should either be doing it the way we did prior to October 3rd with simply issuing a separate statement for each loan on the government side with our statement being in place, or the less desirable option because it increases the costs and work would be to do that actual separate escrow.
So I think what we need to do as escrow professionals when we get a transaction and if we know that there's going to be two loans at the very beginning, we should go to the lender and say, maybe put a disclaimer, yet another disclaimer. Look, if you think that you're going to do a first and second, if it's even in your database thought process that you're going to want two separate statements, then we're going to have to open another transaction for that and address that right up front and not wait until the day we get docs.
And the problem is it isn't usually disclosed that way in the purchase agreement.
Right.
So we don't know about it until the lender decides to give us the heads up, which oftentimes is very late in the game.
But we really shouldn't be saying, well, that person won't do it and I'll do it. We really should not be doing it. And that's our opinion. But I don't think the Department of Business Oversight who regulates us would necessarily want us to be issuing different closing statements for one transaction.
In the same file for one transaction, no. They really, as I said, and we'll have to bring it to them maybe again in this context, in the prior context, they were okay with it because there was a single unified closing statement.
I wonder if we just gave them, just kind of say, look, we can give you the HUD by itself, the 1A that we did prior to October 3rd, and see if they'll take it. We need to remember that, we don't always need to push back and say we're not going to do that. There's sometimes we have to do it, but there are also sometimes that we can say, well, we can't do that, but how about this?
Right.
And have that discussion.
And that's why, and that's part of the reason we're doing these TRID talks is because for this profession, the real estate and services profession, to do the job we need to do for the buyers and sellers that are our consumers, we really need to be talking to each other and having not just talking at each other, but talking to each other and collaborating for solutions that work for everybody. And we already have a lot of increased cost and overhead in general just because of the new regulations, and that's got to get passed on to consumers. But we should be as mindful as we can that we should keep the costs as low as possible, because that really, I think that's the spirit and part of what the CFPB is trying to do is not only know before you owe, but don't have choices. So I think that's really the message we have here as real estate agents, mortgage brokers, lenders, escrow holders, title people. We need to start acting as a team again. whether you're working with somebody we work with all the time or a different person, it's still a team there put in place to get this done for the seller and buyer.
And associations like the Escrow Institute are trying to talk to lenders and trying to get to the bottom of it so that we can maybe say, well, why are you wanting this and what's the deal? So anyway, so thanks PJ for that answer. I think it's a discussion. I don't think that we should be doing it, but it's a discussion that we should have, and we should push back to lenders. And if they say that ABC Escrow is doing it, maybe we should have a conversation with them and say, why are you doing it? And so that we can make sure we're all giving everybody the same professional service and all that.
We should be asking ourselves why we're doing things. And if we're just doing them because we've always done it that way, or if we're doing it just if we don't have a good reason, we should rethink it.
Okay. Thanks a lot. See you next time, PJ.
See you next time, Gina.